Why do turnout gaps still remain? Is it because people do not care, or because the system does not reach everyone equally?
They say just go vote. It's easy to do, but the path to the ballot looks different for you. Some need a language they understand. Some need a guide, a call, a helping hand, a polling place move, a deadline unclear, a long line when waiting when work is near. So when turnout looks low on the screen, ask what barriers are unseen.
It's not just apathy, not one story, not one voice. Turnout is shaped by access, outreach, and choice. From language to history, from contract to trust, democracy works when it includes all of us.
Before 65, the doors were tight. Exclusion laws kept people out of sight. And even today, the barriers stay. Different communities face them in different ways. A voter ID, no language wall, no campaign knock, no outreach call. It is not silence when no one hears. It is a system built through years.
It's not just apathy, not one story, not one voice. Turnout is shaped by access, outreach, and choice. So count every voice. Let the message be clear. Representation starts when everyone can hear.
Minority turnout gaps are not simply because of voter interest. They reflect unequal access, limited outreach, language barriers, and historical exclusion.
Hi everyone, we're going to be doing minority turnout and the monolith problem on Asian Americans. So, minority voter turnout in the US has historically been lower than turnout amongst white voters, although participation rates vary significantly across racial and ethnic groups and across elections. Political scientists argue that these differences cannot be explained by individual motivation or political interest alone. Instead, research shows that institutional factors such as voter ID laws, access to voting resources, political mobilization, and representation can create unequal barriers to participation, contributing to turnout gaps across racial and ethnic groups. So moving into voter identification laws, according to Hajnal et al., strict voter ID laws may contribute to racial turnout gaps by creating additional barriers to voting. Their research found that these laws were associated with lower turnout among voters of color relative to white voters, particularly in primary elections. Turnout decreased more for black voters, and especially for Latinx and Asian voters. However, Grimmer et al. Challenged these findings, arguing that some of those gaps existed before laws were passed, and that the data may not be the best way to measure the law's effects. Now moving to representation, people are more likely to participate when they feel that their community's concerns and experiences are reflected in politics. Voters rarely see candidates who understand their backgrounds or advocate for issues they care about. They may feel disconnected from it altogether. In class, we discussed the two primary types of representation, descriptive and substantive. Now moving into a more focused lens.
So to give some historical background, we're going to first touch on the Chinese Exclusion Act, Asiatic Barred Zone, and the 1965 Immigration Act, as the history of U.S. immigration policies greatly shaped certain waves of Asian communities and regarding to their immigration status and their restriction and their association, how they see themselves within the political system. First off, let's talk about ethnic distinctions. We want to emphasize that Asian communities are not existing within a monolith. Certain aspects, such as 22% of Indian Americans have limited English proficiency compared to 53% of Vietnamese Americans. Factors that influence these differences include the share of each group that is foreign-born, the legacies of British or colonial American colonialism in their home country, and the average levels of educational attainment within the country. And it's also related to either being a highly skilled professional or a refugee. And here is kind of to explain the different political leanings to expand on that. And in regards to that, we're going to be discussing pre-1965 Immigration Act. The first one is the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major federal legislation to ban a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the U.S. The Asiatic Barred Zone is a geographic region created by the U.S. Immigration Act of 1917, prohibiting all immigrants from non-countries owned by the U.S. adjacent to the continent of Asia to enter. And post-1965, this all pretty much ended and abolished the national origin quota that regulated the U.S. immigration since the 1920s. Most of the Asian immigrants that came were highly skilled professionals, part of the brain drain, or part of the end of the Vietnam War and the Secret War, and that came with influx of Southeast Asian immigrants. Here's the growth of the population, and one particular example is on Vietnamese American voters, as many of them arrived as refugees. They have highly strong anti-communist attitudes and vote differently from other Asian American groups. And here is the growth of eligible Asian Americans as a group within the United States, and also being eligible voters over time.
Okay, so moving on to language access. Many eligible voters come from multilingual or limited English proficient communities. So when ballots, voter guides, restriction forms, or election websites are only available in English, voting becomes harder to navigate. This concern grew after President Trump's 2025 executive order designated English as the official language of the U.S. and revoked Clinton's executive order 13166, which had required federal agencies to improve access for people with limited English proficiency. For Asian American voters, reduced language support could make election information less accessible and contribute to turnout gaps. Moreover, Section 203 language provisions of the Voting Rights Act, language minority provisions of the Voting Rights Act, VRA, require that certain states and political subdivisions provide language assistance during elections for certain language minority groups who are unable to speak or understand English adequately enough to participate in the electoral process. So here in this chart, Vietnamese American households have the highest rate of linguistic isolation at 34%, followed by Chinese, Korean, and Bangladeshi Americans. Data from the 2012 AAPI post-election survey indicate that Asian American voters found the language assistance to be limited in jurisdictions that were mandated to provide them. Education as a factor in voting. So this quote here says, on the other hand, education provided to be a major dividing line in Asian American communities. Asian Americans with a college degree supporting Biden by a 71% to 27% margin, while Asian Americans without a college degree only supported Biden by a 59% to 38% margin. By this chart, it is evident that education is one of the strongest predictors of voting. While only 35% of people without a college degree voted in all three elections, that number rises to 54% among college graduates. This suggests that differences in education can play an important role in explaining voter turnout among Asian Americans. Individuals with higher education may have a stronger ability to understanding political and policy readings, voting materials, and communicate with coworkers easier to having open political discussions. So ultimately, our conclusion is that we have expanded upon Grimmer's argument that ethnic studies and historical context are necessary in understanding that there is more to restricting voters than just voter ID laws. In the context of Asian Americans' exclusionary policies from the start of Asian labor migration flows to current voting restrictions are influential beyond the bounds of procedure. Turnout for minority groups requires access, outreach, and choice. Thank you.